Welcome back to the channel. Chris Morrison, Gulfside Ministries. And y'all, I'm really excited today to have with me Jeff Lowder. I suspect if you're watching this, you may not, back of yours, Jeff may not know a whole lot about you because I don't know that a lot of guys go back really deep, far back into the, way back into the world of philosophy of religion and atheist Christianity debate. But you were the founding member and president of InternetInfidels.org back in the day. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. It started off as I was attending a Christian university, and while I was there, I started accumulating content and put it on my personal webpage. And somehow I connected with a guy named Brett Lemoyne, a philosophy student. I think he might have been philosophy and computer science dual major. I can't remember, but he was a student at Texas A&M, and he arranged to create the website at tamu.edu. And that lasted for a short amount of time. And then someone pointed out that we were doing this on a taxpayer-funded server, and we're like, oops. Good point. And so then we went and got a commercial ISP. But that's how it started. I've actually never even met Brett in person, although I've known him since 1995. And from there it just proliferated. We kept building up content. In the early days, it was primarily an archive or repository for a lot of historical documents. As well as we were the website for all of the major atheist organizations, American Humanist Association, Council for Secular Humanism, American Atheists, Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And what year was all that, if you don't mind me asking?
That was back in the late 90s. That was like 95 to 97. And then gradually, as the organizations became more internet savvy, they got their own commercial ISPs, and so we moved, they moved their websites off of ours. And we then and way back then I had been there was a magazine called The Skeptical Review, edited by a former Church of Christ minister named Farrell Till. And the focus of The Skeptical Review was on biblical errancy versus inerrancy. And I hosted that, and then I remember back then we kept getting people telling us constantly, I can't over exaggerate how many people told us this, Christians, well, why don't you guys go read Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict? So then that led to me editing a response to Evidence That Demands a Verdict called The Jury Is In. And
good title.
That's and so that's still on the secular web. But I don't remember specifics, but there was either one or a couple of things that we had posted on our website that illustrated the need for peer review. We weren't claiming to be an academic publisher. We weren't claiming to be a peer reviewed journal. And one or more of the historical documents that we posted, and I think there was also something contemporary that we posted, turned out to be really, really bad. And so I implemented a peer review process, and it took a few years, but we ended up scrubbing the modern library, which is what we call the part of the website that has the contemporary documents, anything written after 1970. Whereas the historical library, it's like, it's historically significant. We're not going to do anything with it. With one exception. There was one document that was so bad that we put a heavy disclaimer banner right up on the top. But we scrubbed.
Was it as bad as the banana argument? I'm sorry, never. Go ahead.
Exactly. And so we ended up scrubbing. We scrubbed the content in the modern library, instituted peer review, and then I made a very concerted effort to go get content published in philosophy journals and worked with authors and publishers to get reprint rights. And so some of the early supporters were, let me think about this, Graham Oppie and Quentin Smith. And Keith Parsons.
Names, both of my viewers know those names well. Graham Oppie and Quentin Smith, both very influential and important atheistic philosophers. If anybody wants to take the philosophy of religion apologetics seriously, you need to know those names and have read their material.
Yeah. And so they were the early adopters, and Michael Martin was another one, and Ted Drange and Keith Parsons. And then towards the end of the 90s, I managed to develop I guess you'd say, a professional relationship with Adolf Grünbaum, the late philosopher of science. And I think he also, I can't remember if he was a psychiatrist or I have in my head that he somehow was also an expert on psychiatry. He was like psychiatry and philosophy, but he was super strong on cosmology. And so when I got when I got permission to post his content, that was a big deal. And then from there, it just, we kept adding more and more authors. And then tried to branch out and not be partisan, and tried to get theists to allow us to post some of their content. Victor Reppert of Argument from Reason fame, he runs the Dangerous Idea blog. I asked him if I could have his permission to republish a couple of his essays. One of them was on miracles. I can't remember what the other one was on. It might have been on miracles too, but he graciously allowed that. There's a Christian philosopher named Stephen Parrish, who had written a critique of objectivism with a capital O. And so I asked a lot of atheists. When I say a lot, I mean greater than 5%. I don't actually know how many there are. It could be 5%, it could be 30, but a non-trivial number of atheists are objectivists with a capital O. And so I wanted to get something on there about that. So he allowed me to republish his critique of objectivism. That's what stands out from sort of the early days. I eventually stepped down around the time that my wife and I started a family, and so I handed it off to other people. So now I'm considered president emeritus. But I haven't been officially involved with the Internet Infidels for more than 20 years. The website lists me as the editor of the Modern Library, but I would be lying if I said I'm spending a lot of time on that. So, the Modern Library has really, fulfilled my goals in terms of filling out that content. Probably the highlight, I think, for me was we had a donor who provided us with a grant to pay Paul Draper to edit an online debate that we hosted back in 2007 called The Great Debate, Does God Exist? And so Paul Draper used his connections, and we got on the non-theist side, Paul, Quentin Smith, John Schellenberg, and Andrew Melnick. And on the theistic side, we got Robin Collins, Alvin Plantinga, Jeff Jordan, and I can't remember who the fourth one is. I apologize to you, whoever you are, philosopher number 4. But,
I'm sure the comments will be blowing up. How dare you?
It's still early here in Seattle, Washington, when we're conducting this interview. But that was a big deal. That funding made it possible to compensate each of the authors to write, their contributions and get people to write. And I think that debate is honestly, and I'm biased, but I think that's one of the better debates available in terms of really getting cutting edge content and engagement from the best thinkers at the time. It wasn't just so and so is one of the top theists, but we're getting one of the top theists writing about a specific topic that is their thing, right? So Alvin Plantinga defended his
Right.
evolutionary argument from naturalism. Paul Draper defended his argument from evil. And then Alvin Plantinga criticized Paul Draper's argument from evil, and Paul responded. And then, Draper criticized the evolutionary argument from naturalism, and Draper responded. John Schellenberg defended his argument from hiddenness, and Jeff Jordan, as I remember, I can't remember what his take was. I'd have to go look it up. Sorry, Dr. Jordan. Memory's a bit foggy, but that was a big deal to get that debate, and I'm super proud of that. So
this is a little off topic where I want to go, but I want to pause and make a comment here, which is that one of the popular notions people have, and I've seen this from both theists and non-theists. Well, they almost shrug their shoulders at philosophy of religion and say, "Oh, well, you keep discussing the same things over and over again, and you never make any progress." I don't think that's true.
I almost feel like the philosophy of religion needs a public relations department. I was tempted to say the word they need apologists for the philosophy of religion, but I'm sure I'd get jumped all over for that. But I think there's a kernel of truth in the dismissive attitudes towards the philosophy of religion, because as an atheist, I roll my eyes at some of the discussions I see coming out of philosophical theology. I'm not going to name names, but there's a reason why the caricature of theology, that it's about how many angels can dance on the head of a head of a needle, head of a pin. There's the reason that caricature exists. It didn't come out of nowhere. I know that a lot of theology is way better than that, but there is an element of truth in that. And I think that at least for the atheist side, a lot of people confuse the philosophy of religion with philosophical theology, and they lump it all together. Right. And so, if philosophical theology is stupid, then philosophy of religion by definition has to be stupid as well, because these people think they're the same thing, even though they're not. Right. And then there's the other issue, which you brought up, which is the lack of progress. But I think for the people who say that, I'm not sure of a non-condescending or adversarial way to make this point, but I would encourage the people who say that to actually go read some philosophy of religion and find out that that's not actually a true statement. There's been a lot of innovative stuff. John Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness has not been debated for centuries. It was developed basically 30 years ago, almost to the year. William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument is centuries old, goes back to at least Al-Ghazali. But there have been a lot of things that are new. Paul Draper's evidential argument from evil is new. Richard Swinburne's Bayesian cumulative approach to defending the existence of God is totally new. I could go on and on and on, but the idea that, well, there's just nothing new, they keep rehashing it over and over. That would be like saying, I don't know, chemistry is dumb because all they do is stuff with chemicals.
With the periodic table over and over again.
And you'd be like, what are you talking about? My best friend from the third grade has a PhD in nuclear chemistry. And I hope I get the element number right. He was on the team of scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory that was the first team to synthesize element 118 on the periodic table of elements. The publication in a scientific journal announcing the synthesis of this element has like 20 authors, and he was a grad student at the time, so I think he's author number 18, but nevertheless, that's my friend. And that was a brand new scientific discovery, how to do that. And just as an aside, and exercise an epistemic humility here, he sent me the article, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that other than the words the, and, or, but, and to, I didn't understand a single word in that article. Not a single verb, not a single noun. It was like, whoa. And so when I saw him, in person, I said, so can you dumb it down for me? And my friend, you have to sort of know him to fully get this, but he went into deep thought and he looked up and he's like, and it was almost like he was a monk in meditation. And he came back to earth 3 minutes later and he's like, no, can't dumb it down for you. I'm like, dang, okay,
fair enough.
Yeah, oh, but so if it sounds dumb to say that chemistry is dumb because they just keep talking about chemicals, I kind of think that I kind of think that's analogous to saying the philosophy of religion is dumb because they don't make any progress.
Right.
There's been a tremendous amount of progress in the philosophy of religion. I think the reason that, especially in the atheist community, it's popular to diss the philosophy of religion is that they think it's nothing but Christian apologetics.
Right.
And that's simply not true. There is, I think, a heavy bias towards Western theism in the philosophy of religion. And that tends to be primarily Christian theism, not Jewish theism or Islamic theism. But there are a number of Christian philosophers doing philosophy of religion that you could say are doing apologetics by virtue of defending the faith.
Right.
But I think they're engaged in real inquiry. They're not just spinning stuff out because it's a way to get from point A to point B. I think there are people who do that. I'm not going to name names, but the people who engage in genuine inquiry, I would say that Daniel Howard Snyder, currently at Western Washington University, is outstanding. And yeah, he's a Christian and he's been extremely critical of Draper's arguments for atheism, but he's a nice guy. He's always very fair. And I've never felt that he makes ad hoc arguments. He everything's independently motivated, and I could give a lot of other examples. So I don't think it's fair to dismiss the philosophy of religion as just Christian apologetics.
Well, this is a fantastic segue because there's two things I want to say real quick. One is why this is why I wanted to have you on here, because one of the things that I want to do with Gulfside Ministries on this channel, and then just my personal ministries, and you and I have spoken a lot on Twitter. I want to raise the level of discourse among popular Christian apologetics. I think for reasons I think we're going to see in just a minute, a lot of it is it's popular for a reason, and everything can't be of the deepest level. But I think that doesn't mean we can't try to raise the value. I mean, part of the way you go about raising the value and raising the conversation is by being honest and critical. And you, Jeff, strike me, and in my experience with you, you have been very, very honest in your assessment of not only your criticisms of Christian arguments, but you've been critical in your assessment of what you see as bad non-Christian, non-theist argument. You said just a moment ago that you had scrubbed articles previously that didn't meet your standard. So I think that your commitment to honesty in discourse over and above, say, the apologetic end goal, if I could use that language, I think that's commendable, and I think that's actually helpful.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not a theist, but I've heard theists in the past say something like, all truth is God's truth. So I think if I were a believer, that's something I would believe. And so if a non-Christian or a non-theist speaks truth, even if that truth is a criticism of a particular argument, I would embrace it.
So that said, there is a particular argument I wanted to kind of work through with you on. I am, as we're recording this, I am recording an introductory to apologetics class that I teach through Gulfside, and it's just Introduction to Apologetics. Links and such in the descriptions below. But in the course of the argument for God's existence, we're going to consider, of course, these are popular arguments. We're going to consider William Lane Craig's moral argument for God's existence. And I think that there are some good things about that argument, and I have some reservations about that argument as well. And so I know that I have watched some of your work previously in the past, and you have some reservations. Otherwise, if you were convinced, you'd be a theist. And
Right.
so I have appreciated some of your. So I want to just put the argument on the screen for anybody who's not immediately aware of how that it goes. I think they probably do, and if not, they should. I'm assuming you can see it there, and if not, you probably have it memorized regardless.
Yep.
But the argument just goes, and this is probably the more popular version of it, but something to the effect of if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. But objective moral values do exist, and therefore God exists. So this argument is clearly valid. If both the premises are true, the conclusion follows. The question is going to be if it's sound. I'll let you comment if you think it's valid or not. But just on that stage, just the pure formality of it seems okay. I have a couple of reservations, but just in general, take your first bite at the apple? Why does this not make you fall to your knees and confess faith in the God of Scripture?
Well, actually, there was a time in my life when I was almost convinced by this argument. Because before I talk about that, though, to respond directly to your something you said, this is a valid argument. So if both premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So yes, it's a valid argument. And also, Craig has more recently updated this argument. So the more recent version adds the words "and duties."
Correct.
And
I thought about adding that, but I didn't want to. Yeah.
Yeah. I was almost convinced by this argument because I was so convinced of the truth of premise 2. And I didn't like the responses to the argument that I was seeing. I didn't know how to articulate it as a college student, but I was a lukewarm Platonist. And I didn't know the word Platonism, but that was sort of my hesitancy. And so I have a real problem with the first premise. And in fact, it's interesting. A lot of Christian apologists, including Craig, like to make a parallel between arguments from evil and the moral arguments. And they'll actually try to flip the argument from evil. And they'll say that if an atheist makes an argument from evil, they are
presuming
supplying
this
the
argument.
premise.
Yep.
Yeah, they're supplying the premise that objective moral values do exist.
Yep.
But they can't exist in an atheist worldview. So by running an argument from evil, you're actually running a self-defeating argument.
Right.
Where I'm going with this is when Christian apologists, well, not just apologists, but philosophers of religion talk about arguments from evil, they split them up into two types. They'll talk about logical arguments from evil versus evidential arguments from evil. And I think it would be interesting to apply the same distinction to moral arguments. So a logical argument from evil or a logical moral argument would say that evil or objective moral values, depending on which argument we're talking about, is logically inconsistent with either theism or atheism. So if we interpret Craig's moral argument as a logical moral argument, we're saying that it is impossible for atheism to be true if objective moral values exist. If God does not exist, it's impossible for objective moral values to exist. But if we say that it's an evidential moral argument, then we say, then we interpret premise 1 as making a probabilistic claim. It would be, if God does not exist, then probably objective moral values do not exist. But objective moral values do exist, therefore probably God exists. And so it's an interesting question just from a hermeneutical perspective, how to interpret Craig.
And I think that is a good question because Craig seems pretty open to the whole Swinburnian project of a Bayesian approach. And if I'm misrepresenting you, please tell me. But it seems like the approach might be something like, given you can imagine possible worlds where God might create, might not create. So given the fact that we have moral, what is the background knowledge? That kind of language seems to fit well with Swinburne's entire approach, and that Craig likes that cumulative kind of argument anyway, whereas more traditional classical theists might just be inclined to make logically arguments around logical necessity. Am I hearing you right? If not, please correct me.
Yeah. Craig likes cumulative arguments, but I'm actually 60% in favor of the idea that Craig, in his own mind, he hasn't, to my knowledge, put this in writing anywhere, but I'm 60% confident that Craig thinks of his argument as a logical moral argument. He thinks there is no possible world in which objective moral values exist, but God does not exist. In fact, actually, now that I think about it, I'm a lot more than 60% confident, because Craig says that there is no possible world in which God does not exist. So if we use possible world semantics, which is how Plantinga came up with his refutation of Mackey's logical argument from evil, then that would support the idea that this is a logical argument. Well, so what? What if it is a logical moral argument? I would say that I would say two things. My first point would be this, that let's assume that God exists, and that objective moral values exist. The statement God exists by itself actually tells us nothing about the meta-ethical relationship between God and objective moral values, or God's nature and moral values, or God's commands and moral duties.
And the technical language there, we'd say something like God's existence underdetermines the nature of morality, right?
Bingo. Yeah. So Craig is a modified divine command theorist. He believes that that God's commands create our moral duties and obligations, and that God's nature is the paradigm or locus of moral value. That is one possible view for a theist to hold. That is not the only possible view. I'm out of my depth here, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Augustine and Aquinas would take a view that I'm going to call the divine simplicity theory of moral goodness, and say that God just is goodness.
Right. And he's not good. Exactly. The good is not some standard that God measures up to. You're right. It's hard to dumb down and explain, but no, goodness just is identical with the essence of God. And that's because in technical language, good is convertible with being. And
so that view might support Craig's first premise. I'm not really sure. But that's another view. And then there are, of course, Christian Platonists who think that, there is a form of the good that exists in, I think this is sort of I don't know if this is a pejorative thing to say, but there is a form of the good that exists in Plato's heaven, but there basically are abstract objects.
Right.
And among these abstract objects includes objective moral values. Although, as I say that out loud, I don't think anybody's really done a lot of conceptual analysis of that. And I'm thinking that if moral values exist as abstract objects, they're not a distinct type of abstract objects. They would simply be propositions about moral value. So it's not like if you're a Platonist, you think there are sets, numbers, possible worlds, and propositions, and moral values. Moral values would just be a type of proposition, but that's a topic for another day.
It's I'm not a Platonist, and so I would have to kind of be charitable. That's probably a way to take that. But I think the existence of Platonism is worth noting. So first of all, let's just I just want to pause in case we're ahead of somebody. We've used the word Platonism and abstract objects, a couple of things now. So real quick, because what I want to do is define those terms. I want to real quick assess why you like premise two, because a lot of atheists don't like premise two, and a lot of Christians think that's where the argument should be. If we can have that, hopefully get that addressed, because I think that's provide the conversation about why, in my opinion, the real issue is around one. Whether people agree with that or not. So real quick, define for me, what is Platonism? Because I think that's relevant in the back end we talk about the first premise.
So Neoplatonism, contemporary Platonism, as I understand it, is the view that there is a third realm of reality. So what are the first and second realms? They would be the mental world and the physical world.
Right.
So the mental world and the physical world are able to stand in causal relations. They can be causes and they can be effects. I
can decide to drink my coffee.
Yeah. So the third realm of abstract objects, if it exists, would include things like numbers. Well, the number two cannot, it's not just that it does not cause anything, it cannot cause anything. And it is never the effect of anything, and it cannot be the effect of anything. So it's abstract, whereas the physical world and the mental world are concrete. So a Platonist is someone who believes that there exist abstract objects like numbers, sets, propositions.
Right. The number three is real in some real sense. They actually,
it's immaterial. It's not in space. It's not spatiotemporal. So it's not in space. It's not in time, and it is uncreated. And so the idea that there are things that are uncreated, even abstract things, is why a significant number of theists don't like Platonism from a theological point of view. But from I guess you could say from an atheological point of view, atheists who don't like Platonism don't like it because it's immaterial.
Right.
And
it's
so
got haters on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you say objective moral values do exist, if you zoom in or focus in on the word exist, what is the metaphysical nature of an objective moral value? It could be, one idea might be that it's something physical. Another idea might be that it's something mental, like an idea in God's mind or, part of God's nature. And then another idea would be that it is abstract. There's a proposition that is eternally or timelessly true, that it is, for example, bad to torture babies for fun. And there's nothing that could make that true, nothing external that could make that true. It's just necessarily true. It's impossible for it to be false. Many atheists are materialists, and so they reject the existence not just of immaterial, concrete entities like God, gods, angels, demons, ghosts, spirits, whatever, but they also reject the existence of immaterial abstract objects. And so, for people who are materialists, that lends that is like background information that for them adds credibility to the first premise. It doesn't fully yield the first premise because there's still the possibility that objective moral values are actually just physical objects or physical entities, which is a can of worms that I'm happy to go into if you want to. But so that's what Platonism and abstract objects means. And I'm not a Platonist, but I'm not a materialist. I'm an agnostic about the existence of abstract objects. And so because I don't know if abstract objects exist, even if I were certain that abstract objects are not physical properties, it wouldn't follow for me as an atheist that they can't exist, because my ontology still has room for them as immaterial objects.
So it's something I want to pull out from here for my Christian users who want to use this argument and any strengths that it might have. We have to be careful and just don't make the equation between materialism and atheism. Atheism does not necessarily entail materialism. That's just, you can't assume. Now, it may be possible, just statistically, a lot of, especially popular atheists, they're just materialists because they feel like it follows. but that doesn't necessarily follow. I think it may be fair to say, and again, you may disagree, and that's all right. It may be fair to say this argument is stronger against materialism, because I think the first premise, which is I think maybe both premises, are harder to get to on materialism. Harder doesn't mean you can't, but I think that because there are so many types of, potentially so many types of atheism, I don't think you can just presume that not having a God intrinsically means that there's no ontological space in any sense for an objective moral value in any mode of existence. I just don't know that you can, on the surface, make that charge. You have to ask more about what people mean, and you have to get more into their ontological commitments.
I mean, as an atheist, I hate talking this way, but for Christians, it might be easier to think of atheism as a church with denominations. And so one denomination is, the First Church of Materialism, Baptist, and yeah. the other denomination is the First Church of Naturalism, Platonist. The key point being that just like, I don't think I could disprove God by refuting Martin Luther's theology. It would be a strange argument for God's existence by refuting the atheology of the materialist denomination. Like I said, I'm not crazy about that, about that metaphor, but
we'll
maybe
take it as a metaphor only,
yeah.
And nothing more. So yeah. I think that I other than just a quick caveat that there are atheists who reject the second premise, I want to be careful and not paint them all together. I have my thoughts as to what the motivating factor is. Jeff, I just want to say I'm not a big fan of intuitions in the world of philosophy. This really analytical philosophers, and maybe you love intuitions. That's not a big thing I'm into. But I just, I don't really understand why, other than what motivates people to reject objective moral values, other than perhaps a pre-existing ontology they don't think allows for them. But anti-realism is a real thing. And I know that it's a long debate, and I think that people need to be aware of that. But I do think that if someone says, no, I believe that it's really wrong to use your example, torture babies for no reason. If they think that's really wrong, I think we should take people at their word. Okay, you think that there's an objective fact in the world that you shouldn't do that there really is a right or wrong. Well, then the question is, for me then, and I think this is the way I understand the first premise, if you take that, what is your ontological grounding? What do you think makes it wrong? And I think that's where the conversation really, it's that first premise, because Craig wants to say what the first premise seems to reduce to is the only possible grounding of that intuition that we have that there really are wrong things and right things. The only possible grounding is God. That seems to be what he's trying to get at.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because he talks a lot about, the ontological foundation for moral values. And I actually had an email conversation with him about 20 years ago about this very topic. And that's where it became clear. And that's what caused me in one of my YouTube videos, where I spent an entire hour going through this argument, to talk about the word objective, because the word objective has multiple meanings, legitimate definitions among professional philosophers. There's an epistemological sense of objective, think impartial observers, and then there's an ontological sense of objective. And Craig is talking about ontological objectivity. So really his premise 2 could be rewritten as ontologically objective moral values do exist. And premise 1 would then be, if God does not exist, ontologically objective moral values do not exist. And the idea seems to be, as exactly as you said, that in order for ontologically objective moral values to exist, they have to be, they need a foundation, and they need to be grounded in something.
Right.
And he thinks that God's nature is the best candidate for how to ground moral values. Right. The Platonist, whether they're a Christian or an atheist, would say, actually, no, that's wrong. Abstract objects, or Platonic forms, whatever you want to call them, are sui generis things that don't require grounding. They are necessarily true. And And then Craig's response to that would be to say, yes, they are true, but some necessary truths are grounded by other necessary truths. And he has an example from mathematics to both illustrate that and to defend that claim. And I think I agree with him that it is possible for some necessary truths to ground other necessary truths. What I would say in response to that is, yeah, I think you're right, but you need to show that a particular necessary truth needs to be grounded in another necessary truth.
It doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be the case that the possibility of grounding entails the necessity of grounding.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, yeah, theoretically or in the abstract sense, a necessary truth about anything, whatever, about X, whatever X is, yeah, it might be grounded in another necessary truth. But if you want to use that to say that Platonism is inferior to, Craig's view, which I call the divine nature theory of moral values. If you want to say that divine nature theory is superior to Platonism, then you need to provide an argument that those Platonic necessary moral truths need grounding. And then this is where the Euthyphro Dilemma comes into the conversation, usually from atheists. I've been pretty public in my lack of enthusiasm for the Euthyphro Dilemma, to the point that I've actually got a draft essay up on my blog that is a critique of the Euthyphro Dilemma. I don't think it's the killer objection so many people in my camp think it is, but I think to like fast forward through like 20 salvos back and forth between theists and atheists, what I think the Euthyphro Dilemma shows is that any meta-ethical theory, not just divine command theory, but secular theories as well, ultimately rest upon a brute fact. So, and Eric Wielenberg, the atheist philosopher, makes this point more articulately than I am able to do. But he says, at the end of the day, Craig's view includes certain brute facts, like, God's nature is kind, just, loving, et cetera, whereas Wielenberg's ethical brute facts includes things like, pain is intrinsically bad. And so all worldviews or all meta-ethical theories have these ethical brute facts. I think I'm sort of blending topics here, but I think the reason so many atheists, not just atheists, but primarily atheists, like the Euthyphro Dilemma, is in their mind, they think, well, if I can reduce the theist, whatever kind of theist they are, into, having to admit that there are brute ethical facts on their view, I've somehow won the Super Bowl. And I think that's ridiculous. That would only be a significant accomplishment if the theist had brute facts and the atheist didn't. But that's not true.
But there are brute facts on both sides. You end up with stalemate,
for literally any meta-ethical theory that you can posit, you can create a variant of the Euthyphro Dilemma and apply it to that. And so divine command theory, modified divine command theory, divine intention theory, whatever it is, you can apply a version of the Euthyphro Dilemma and show that it rests upon a brute fact. But you can do the same thing to utilitarianism, to Kant's categorical imperative, Larry Arnhart's Darwinian natural right. Any secular theory you want, you could use basically the same argument. And so it's not this decisive killer argument that destroys theistic meta-ethical theories. All it shows, in my opinion, is that everybody's stuck with some brute facts, where brute means not grounded by other facts. They may be necessary facts, necessarily true facts, but they're not grounded in anything else. So I think that's I think that's a stalemate between theistic meta-ethicists and their naturalistic counterparts.
Right.
And so if I transition now to the first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist.
No, hang on, you muted yourself.
Sorry. I think one way that this premise gets plausibility is from slogans. There's a slogan, laws require a lawgiver. There's another slogan, values require a valuer. And what's interesting is Craig's divine nature theory, which he gets from Robert Adams, actually rejects the slogan, values require a valuer, because to say that moral values are grounded in God's nature, well, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what does the expression God's nature mean?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that God's nature is just another way of saying God's essential attributes. So God is essentially just, or God is essentially merciful. Yep. And I understand that for a Thomas, these are analogical ways of speaking, but that's what people mean when they say God's nature. So
the popular view of God, and I think probably most people, even my own view, that they imagine that God has the set of things, and they honestly, I mean, like Plantinga really thinks that there's maximal goodness, so goodness is a thing, and there's maximal justice, and justice is a thing, and they take all these good properties and they just attribute them in the highest form to God and say God must have these because that's what it means to be God. Well, then how does he have those? Well, that's just brute by necessity, and they just, by definition, and they feel like they have some sort of justification. Well, because that would be the greatest possible thing. That's kind of
it's perfect being theology.
But to your point, it's still just brute. It's just that's just goodness. Just is that
right? So where I was going with this is that if you subscribe to that view, then on that view, values are not the results of a conscious evaluative process, like a real estate appraiser coming to somebody's house and saying, "Oh, I think your house is worth $400,000."
Right.
That would be a mental act of valuation. That's not at all what Craig's theory, his divine nature theory, my name, for his view, that's not at all what the divine nature theory of moral values says. The divine nature theory of moral values says there is not a mental act evaluation. It's far more abstract than that. It's just, this is the way God is necessarily. God is necessarily forgiving and kind and loving and honest, and all these other attributes. And so that slogan, ironically, plays no work at all in supporting the argument. Craig's argument seems to be, I'm trying to steelman him here, is that God is the best, or his nature is the best option among the candidates for what would be the standard of the good.
Yeah. And, so can I say, would it be fair to suggest that Craig's actually using a type of abductive argument where he's looking at all these possible scenarios and he's saying, out of all these possible gods is the only one, and he thinks makes sense, but then really what he's saying is, given the problems, this is the one we ought to settle on if we want to believe there's objective moral values. Would that be a fair way to understand him?
That's a really interesting question.
I'm trying to be really nice to him, because I'm not a Craigian. My ontology of God is not Craig. So I'm trying to find a way to understand him in a way that's very charitable.
I'm not sure. You might be right about that. You might be onto something there. But regardless of whether it's deductive or abductive or inductive or some other ductive, I would say that those of us who either are Platonists or at least Platonist adjacent would say that our meta-ethical theory, our ontology, is simpler in the following way. If you're going to have brute facts anyway, if it's moral values are grounded in God's nature because God is essentially just, kind, forgiving, loving, etc. Why not take out the middleman and just say that moral values are directly grounded in those things?
Right.
What do you get? What's the extra thing you get by saying that it latches on to God's nature? It makes it a lot more complicated than the Platonist alternative. And I generally don't use this word, but this time I mean it sincerely. I think it's justified and appropriate. The Platonist doesn't have to go through all the mental gymnastics that the Craigian does in order to make this really complicated divine nature theory work.
Right.
And so that would be that. If I were to have a debate with Craig, this would be one of the points that I would make.
Right.
It's actually, apart from like the ontology, it actually makes it really confusing. It's really hard to understand. Now, hard to understand doesn't mean it's false, but I think it is some sort of a theoretical virtue that Platonism in this sense is easier to understand. And I know that he would say the exact opposite. He says when he tries to understand Platonism, his mind draws a blank. He thinks it borders on unintelligible. And so we're at an impasse there. I think that his view is very difficult to understand. I think I understand it, but why go through all these gymnastics, and why not just take out the middleman?
Right. There's an excellent paper, and I think you've referenced it either in conversations by Whelan, titled something effective Dawkins Gambit, or it's about Hume's aroma, that paper. Yep. And it's a discussion on Richard Dawkins. I think objectively awful. Whatever you think, I think it's a terrible argument.
I agree.
But he goes through ways in which the argument doesn't work. But he points out, and this is, I think, a phenomenal point. It was a central part of my own argument when I had my master's work, is that Dawkins' argument, at least a modification, works against the God, as we may say something like Craig would imagine it, but it doesn't work against a simple God. And the reason is because Hume is going to come along in Dialogues 9 and just say, if you can have a necessary God who's extremely complicated and he's just necessary in virtue of his necessity, why can't I just have a world that's necessary in virtue of necessity? And if you're going to appeal to mystery, why can't I? And I don't think that that's an assailable position. I think that if you're going to allow this composite complex object to be necessary, I don't see the virtue in not saying things that are in front of us and saying, well, this is in some sense we don't understand, even though it's composite, that it's not also necessary. That's my worry about a nature theory like Craig has, where you have all of these, whether he means or not, they're almost Platonic in nature, these values that are just necessary and then pieced together. I don't think that that's meaningful, personally.
Yeah. I don't think that I agree that Dawkins' argument is successful against Craig's view of God. I hear what you're saying. I mean, Craig does not affirm divine simplicity.
No, he doesn't. Well, not in the sense I do. He has a restricted version of it.
Right. I don't think the Dawkins argument even works against Craig's view of God. I think that Dawkins' argument probably works against
like
a conception of God that some average person on the street who's never studied theology or apologetics might hold to, but among scholars, I think it tears down a complete straw man. I mean, there's really nothing positive to say for it other than, I guess, if I'm being charitable, well, at least he gave an argument he gave an argument. It's a piece of garbage, but yeah, he gave an argument.
Well, I misstated because what I meant was not the Dawkins argument. I meant the conversation that comes out of that, Hume's argument against which he's following.
Oh, I see. Okay, I got you.
I think that is problematic, and taking it back to a moral context. So people can read that paper and and see for themselves. I'm trying not to do a giant commercial for Thomistic simplicity here, but I think that this is one of my independent motivating factors for.
Well, you're a Thomist, and it's your channel. You're allowed to do that.
That's right. Well, in fairness, by the way, my co-host is not exactly. So
okay.
These are places where Christians can disagree, but I think that it's incumbent upon Christians who want to affirm Craig's divine nature theory, as you're calling it. I like that term. They need to figure out a way to ground. And I think just asserting brute necessity doesn't get you more than asserting the brute necessity of facts. So this raises a question for me real quick is viewers are going to want to know, well, I'm giving you a lot of space. What is, if you do affirm the second, how do you just appeal to the bruteness of moral facts? And you just,
so
how do you
here's
do
why
that?
I'm agnostic. For me, there are two live options. Option number one is Platonism, like Eric Wielenberg, and a century ago, G.E. Moore. Option number two is ethical naturalism, the view that moral values just are physical properties. Now, what would that mean? Christians, the vast majority of Christians, I assume, are not physicalists. They're dualists, right, or dualist interactionists. But for those of us who are open to the idea that the mind just is the brain, then even though I think moral values are in some sense a mental, or they might be something mental just reduces to the physical anyway. So the ethical naturalist theory that I'm open to, it comes from a guy named Larry Arnhart, who wrote a book called Darwinian Natural Right. So it's a secular natural law theory, which probably would be very interesting to someone with a Thomistic background, because my understanding is that, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a natural affinity between Thomism and Aristotelian ethics.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So on a Darwinian natural lawyer or Darwinian natural law theorist would say that the good is the desirable, and the desirable is what is almost universally desired by human beings across culture and time. And we can find out empirically what those universal values are through anthropology and sociology. And it's things like love, family, friendships, art, music, even religious understanding is one of the things that Larry Arnhart includes in his list of 20 natural desires. And so so then this raises the question, here's another question about the meaning of objective. I've already said that Craig means ontological objectivity. That turns out to not be specific enough, because even if you stipulate we're talking about ontological objectivity, there's still a question of, okay, we know it's ontological, not epistemological objectivity, but there's another sense. Some people say that in order to have objectivity, it has to be completely mind independent. Other people say that in order to have objectivity, it just has to be human mind independent. Well, I would say, I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer here. It's just how you set up your definitions. I would say that the least controversial way of putting it is that Larry Arnhart's theory may not be objective in a totally mind independent way, but it's intersubjective. So it's something that we discover empirically. We don't get to make it up. It's rooted in facts of biology, but the facts of biology are facts about human desires, and desires by definition are mind dependent. So it's sort of straddles the ground between subjectivity and objectivity. It's intersubjective. And so I think that if I were to reject Platonism, I would say that Arnhart's theory is the leading candidate, for people who want to say that moral values are somehow physical physical properties.
Now, let me just
So
dismiss something real quick, though,
yeah,
because
go ahead.
there may be somebody who this is all new to. They might be hearing you to say, and if this is what you're saying, fine, I'm not hearing this, but there are some people who might be hearing you to say, take that you're just arguing that the evolutionary process of mankind gives us a survival advantage, and because of we're empathetic, and this is just our biology. And the standard response to that, which is something like, well, just because that's what our biology has taught us that we want to do because of that feeling, it doesn't actually mean that we should. Not that doesn't actually make it wrong, and kind of pulls us right back to that high level. You seem to be saying, when you talk about the facts of the biological nature, you seem to be saying something more than the history of how we got them.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the other thing I would say is what comes up for me as I was listening to you, what does it mean what do the words should and ought mean? Right. And this gets right back to what is the theoretical definition of morality. My theory, I don't have data to back this up, but my theory is that part of the reason that moral apologetics is so practically difficult to pull off is that all of these words have lots of legitimate definitions. And so even when everybody has good intent, it's really hard to have a meaningful conversation, either because people are assuming different definitions of the same words, or you have to spend a tremendous amount of time making these really hair-splitting distinctions so that you're all on the same page. The definitions of the words should and ought are a case in point. If you think that morality, if the theoretical definition of morality is something like a set of rules for how you treat other people, that's going to take you down one path in conversations like this. If you think that morality is something more like a set of rules for how you should live, even if you were stranded on a desert isle and didn't interact with another person, that's going to take you down a very different path. I personally think that morality is closer to the second option. It's more like a set of rules for how you should live, with or without other people in the picture. So even
and you may be surprised to know, or not surprised to know, actually the classical conception of morality, like before Kant, was actually more aligned with what you're talking about here. I don't think Aquinas would have actually recognized the idea that strictly ethical behavior gets tagged as morality. He would have thought, are you acting rationally or not? Where rationally doesn't just mean, if I want to do this, therefore I do, that's rational. For him, rationality has, what does it mean to be human, taking it's his whole natural law theory, which is Aristotelian orientation. The rational thing is that which maximizes your being as a human, and you can't do that apart from community. It's a very holistic perspective.
I'll take your word for it on that, because I haven't studied Aquinas enough to have an informed opinion.
That's fine.
But so that would be the first point I would make about these two schools of thought around morality. The second point I would make is around, here's another distinction around imperatives. There's categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. I've studied metaethics a lot. I actually haven't studied ethics very much. So like the arguments for and against utilitarianism, Kantianism, I'm not in any way an expert on that, but based on what I do know, I find Kantianism very difficult to understand. And here's why. Hypothetical imperative says if your goal is X, you should do Y. That makes total sense to me. Easy to understand. I think I could teach it to a first grader. Kant's categorical imperative, or not Kant per se, but a categorical imperative gets rid of the if your goal is X part of the hypothetical imperative and just says do Y. And if all you have is that categorical imperative, there's no hypothetical in front of it, it opens the door to the question, well, why should I do Y? Right?
I think that gets back to a grounding problem again.
The hypothetical imperatives have the answer built in. It's not even possible to express a hypothetical imperative without implicitly answering the why question. Whereas a categorical imperative, you might come up with quasi justifications, but you're now in tension with your commitment to the categorical imperative. Because if you really believe that, then you'd have to say maybe there are prudential reasons why you should do Y, but that's not supposed to be the grounding for why you should do Y. You just should do Y, period. And that doesn't resonate with me. Yeah. I'm choosing my words carefully. I don't want to say it's incoherent or unintelligible, but it just that I don't find that compelling. I guess
it's not the only meta-ethical view, and so why adopt if it has all the problems that it does?
So Arnhardt's view is, and I'm assuming that this would generalize to a theistic version of natural law theory. Arnhardt's version of natural law theory is effectively a system of hypothetical imperatives. And so one of its virtues, I think, is it's incredibly easy to understand. Say whatever else you might want to say about it. At least we know what the heck we're talking about. It answers the question, why should I be moral? Well, if morality is defined as a set of rules for how you should live, informed by empirical facts from biology about human nature, well, then, why should you have friendships? Because human beings generally have a deep-seated desire to have, rich, rewarding friendships. Why should you have children? Most people generally desire to have children. Why should you enjoy music or art? Because most people enjoy that. And I don't want to make it sound hedonistic because I just use the word enjoy a lot, but
that's okay.
These are
C.S. Lewis is you're in good company. He said that we don't take our pleasures seriously enough. He called himself a Christian hedonist, much to the Renaissance.
Oh, okay, fair enough. So, those I think those are some virtues of Arnhardt's theory, but more generally, I think those are virtues of natural law theory. And so, depending on if I were debating Craig or someone who shares Craig's views, one of my responses to the argument would be, well, I think Arnhardt's theory is very plausible. And depending on how you're defining objective, you might say that Arnhardt's theory is not objective, it's intersubjective, in which case it would deny the second premise, or you might say it's objective. But if it denies it, a lot of the classical arguments that come up in support of the second premise, I don't think work against intersubjective moral values. Because one of the big arguments against it is pragmatic. It's impossible to live as if there are no objective moral values. Well,
but in fact,
yeah, right. But so if Arnhardt's theory is not objective, then his theory disproves that argument, because it is possible to consistently live as if moral values are intersubjective. It's probably true that it's not possible to consistently live if moral values are, utterly subjective relative to individual persons. That's probably a good argument. But against intersubjective values, I think it's worthless. That argument has no weight at all.
It dawns on me, it may be helpful for viewers to distinguish between, again, here's all these distinctions. I think one way to distinguish types of subjectivity, one of many ways. I think about pain as subjective. If I smash my finger, well, that's a subjective experience by nature. But there's a type of objectivity to it. Clearly, it's a natural part of the process. It's going to happen. The preference for ice cream is entirely different than the pain I'm going to feel. I think when a lot of Christians, and me included when I was first introduced to this argument, they hear about subjective values, they think about mere preferences and the idea that, well, I can choose to prefer that. When you're talking about grounding these in human nature, you're saying something about the way humans are built that's undeniable and discovered about human beings.
Yeah, exactly right. It's discovered, not invented. And I think that's at the heart of the distinction between moral realism and anti-realism, at least the cognitive versions of moral anti-realism. And so so it seems to me that I'm happy to stipulate whatever definition of objective. I'm not really locked into a preferred set of terms, but depending on how a person defines objective, Arnhardt's Darwinian natural law theory is either objective or intersubjective, but either way, the arguments and the concerns and the worries that motivate premise two, I think are impotent against intersubjective moral values. Like, well, if objective moral values don't exist, then there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. Well, actually, from Arnhardt's theory, there is something really wrong, and it's actually kind of presumptuous and arrogant and condescending to say that the only way to have something really wrong is if you agree with Craig's meta-ethical theory. I could just as easily invert that and say, if moral values are tied to God's nature as revealed to us through a dusty 2,000-year-old book, then there's nothing really wrong with anything, right? And that wouldn't be a good argument either. So let's drop the.
I think Alex O'Connor has made a similar. Yeah, I think Alex O'Connor has made a similar argument, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think that he's about, on Craig's view, even God's type of morality would be subjective if it's just merely his preferences that are imposed upon it. I may have.
I actually haven't watched any of his videos yet. I follow him on Twitter. I just started following him a couple of weeks ago. I haven't watched his videos, so I can't comment specifically on that. But what I can say is that kind of argument. Again, it depends upon how we're defining subjectivity versus objectivity. A lot of atheists want to say that objectivity means full-blown mind independence, and theists who are not Platonists, people like Craig, will push back on that because, first of all, it conflicts with their claim that God grounds objective moral values, but they'll also say that they believe that God sustains everything. So if objectivity means mind independence, then the existence of the earth is no longer an objective fact because it's grounded in God, in God's subjective states, is what they would say.
Yeah.
And so that to me is kind of a can of worms.
Yeah.
I actually am starting to think that we need a whole new vocabulary to have these kinds of discussions, because there's so many words that are key that have so many legitimate meanings that were not coined by an atheist or a theist to avoid an argument they don't like. These are independently motivated meanings. We need a whole new vocabulary. It's just so hard to have an informed discussion that is accessible to someone who hasn't studied this stuff for a long period of time.
And even some of this stuff we're having is going to be difficult for some. Let me start to wrap up. I want to close on two things real quick. One is, so we've said a lot of the problems that this argument has, but it's not worthless. I don't think it is.
Correct.
I mean, it has some real value, and I think that there are people who dismiss it out of hand, largely because they don't appreciate the distinctions. So I have a pitch I'm going to make of the worthiness of it that you may or may not agree with. But before I share mine, and then after that, I'm going to finish up by the taxonomy thing as a commercial for you. But what do you think? So you've given, I think, some of your criticism, maybe not all, but some of them. What would you think is the positive assessment? What is the utility of this argument? What does it show?
I think that the defense of premise two is effective against simple forms of moral subjectivism or relativism. And I know that, my fellow atheists who are subjectivists or relativists will not be happy with me for saying that. But I think that, someone who says that, I disagree that the sentence rape is morally wrong is true. I think that's a tough sell. And I'm glad that I don't believe that. And therefore, I'm glad I don't have to defend that.
That loses some rhetorical points in debate, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think there's clear value in that. And I think that you'll find a lot of college students who will say that they are relativists or subjectivists, but it's easy for someone who knows what they're doing to, quickly get them to backtrack, because you'll find out whatever the hot social issue of the day is, whether it's trans rights or Black Lives Matter or what's in the news today, affirmative action and college admissions, whatever the issue is, people, or gay rights, gay marriage.
Any political item whatsoever, you get their political thing because everybody's moral argument of politics.
Yeah, and so
what do you think about this indictment? Right.
Yeah, you can link their political views to a not always, but in many cases, you can link their political views to a subconscious commitment to moral objectivity. When they say that, for example, I'm going to pick on trans rights are human rights. The average person who says that, I don't think, is saying the equivalent of vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream. I think they're saying something much stronger than that.
And they want to be saying something stronger than that.
Yeah. And so then it's kind of a wedge issue, because you can, use that as an opening to, say, are you really sure you're a subjectivist? Are you really sure you're a relativist? Because what I'm hearing from you, sure doesn't sound like subjectivism to me, because if it was purely subjective, you saying trans rights are human rights, well, someone else could say, well, they're not human rights.
Right.
Just like someone else could say chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla. Right. So I think that's a wedge issue. In terms of the first premise, I'm not sure. My intuition tells me that there might be a good moral argument for God's existence, but it's not this one. So I haven't figured out what that is. If I figure it out, I'll publish it, and I'll do a YouTube video on it.
There you go.
But there are a lot of people who find this first premise compelling. That's what I would say is points in favor of this argument.
It does seem to have, the first premise has, again, whatever you think of intuitions, there are people, maybe just by cultural closeness, they can easily latch on to that. I think for a lot of reasons you can probably work out. Let me offer my pitch and let you respond to it real quick. I think the second premise is highly defensible in a lot of ways. And I think anybody, to your point, I think anybody who wants to argue against that, you take the, pardon the pun, moral high ground immediately. And to the extent that debate and apologetics is a public event, I think that you've won just on rhetorical value. And I hate to talk about terms of winning, but people care about that kind of stuff. I think the more interesting thing about this argument is whether it establishes God's existence. I think what it clearly does, for me anyway, is it establishes the need for a grounding of moral claims, objective moral claims. And the question is, what is that grounding? So I think that you can posit with Craig that God makes a possible grounding if you can cash that out in a coherent way, which is a separate conversation. I think that, and I hope, my hope for the atheist community, and I don't want to speak for the atheist community, but in terms of trying to bring people together, I would hope that something like either atheistic Platonism, or in my view better, atheistic Aristotelianism, I think goes a long way, because I think the argument really goes a long way to establish, if you're going to reject Platonism out of hand, which I'm fine with, I think what it shows is that the human nature is real. I think this argument is a fantastic argument. However you want to exactly put the taxonomy, I think it goes a long way to show that whatever we mean by human nature, that's a real thing, and that human nature needs to be taken seriously. So the first premise can be restated something like, if human nature is not ontologically real, whatever, cash out what that means, then there is no grounding for objective moral values. But there is objective, therefore, human nature is an ontological reality. And then we can continue well, then what is the implication of an ontologically real human? Are there any implications? I think that's a good place to move the argument forward. Maybe you can make an argument for God's existence from there, but I think that that's probably what the argument can show. And it might work to limit the probability space for certain types of atheism who want to argue against the reality of human nature. That's kind of the way that I have been prone to take it.
I like that, actually. I think that's a great way of thinking of it. I agree. You've convinced me.
Well, that's worthwhile and important. Important. So you write that article then and help them understand it. So to finish up, so we've been talking just a little bit about taxonomy at the end. You have done a series of videos on taxonomy you're still working on. So for those who made it this far, say a little about that video, how you think the conversation we've had relates to taxonomy, and especially your comment about language. I think the way we talk about that might go in that direction. So say something about that, please.
Yeah, so I have a background as in high school debate. I was the captain of my debate team. And so I know a lot about argumentation theory. So this taxonomy that you're referring to, I'm not speaking from a philosophy of religion perspective. I'm speaking from an argumentation theory perspective, although there is some overlap.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that in debate, in competitive debate between high school students and college students, there's an understood taxonomy of arguments that helps people prepare for debates. It makes communication more effective, that sort of thing. And so I had the idea, what if there were a similar taxonomy for philosophy of religion debates and related debates? And in argumentation theory, these taxonomies are called stock issues. Mm-hmm. And so I've been developing a theory of stock issues for philosophy of religion debates. And the idea is that for any argument you can think of that would be relevant, it fits into one of three categories. It's either an impossibility argument, a improbability argument, or a pragmatic argument. I think that Craig's moral argument is an impossibility argument against atheism. Mm-hmm. Whereas, say, something like the fine-tuning argument, well, even that turns out to be interesting, but there are certain some design arguments would be improbability arguments.
Right.
And then Pascal's wager would be a pragmatic argument for belief in the existence of God.
Right.
So that's what I've been working on with my taxonomy. And it's actually been a really interesting research project. It's forced me to think through, revisit things that I've thought about and think through some things that I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about, to come up with this theory that I can apply equally to arguments for God's existence and against God's existence, and be able to pinpoint precisely, in debates about them, whether they're formal debates or not, what are the issues to focus on, and where the objections would lie. It kind of provides a map, if you will, for debaters and thinkers for how to think about these different kinds of arguments.
Yeah, and I have seen the first couple of those. They are really phenomenal. So I really think I want to encourage anybody, again, who's made it this far in this video, you're clearly interested in arguments. I really want to encourage anybody, make sure you go over there, check it out, subscribe, because that's some phenomenal stuff. And it's Jeff, it's helped me just as I'm thinking through how to classify some of these things as well. So, well, that's kind of all the big thing. Is there anything else that you wanted to hit on to touch on with this argument?
I just wanted to publicly thank you. Yeah, Chris, I just wanted to publicly thank you. Chris actually reviewed early drafts of the first two videos on those stock issues. So I wanted to say thank you, Chris, for that. And also thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again. Listen, welcome anytime. So we'll go ahead and end it here. I always say to my viewers, and I'll say to you, Jeff, until we see you next time, may God richly bless you. Thanks so much, and God bless.
Thank you.